400 motorcycles filled a snow-covered street at 7 in the morning, engines rumbling loud enough to shake the windows of a house that no longer belonged to the elderly couple standing frozen on their own porch. Robert Hendricks had 30 minutes before deputies arrived to remove everything he'd built in 31 years. He didn't recognize a single rider until a grey-bearded stranger stepped forward and said 6 words that stopped him cold. "You fixed my bike," I remembered. Nobody in that crowd had come for trouble, but by the time the sheriff's car pulled up, something had already changed. Something the bank never saw coming, and something this small town would talk about for years. Robert Hendricks had learned over 74 years of living that some sounds you never forget. The screech of a Jeep engine on a dirt road outside Da Nang. The click of a hospital monitor the night his heart gave out 3 years ago. And now this one. The soft rustle of an envelope sliding under the front door of the only house he and Patricia had ever owned. He picked it up before Patricia could see it, the way he'd been doing for the last 2 months, and carried it into the kitchen where the coffee was still warm. Outside, the first real snow of the season fell over Elm Street, dusting the bare maple tree Patricia had planted the year they moved in, back when their son Michael was still small enough to ride on Robert's shoulders. The envelope had the return address of Millhaven Trust Bank printed in the corner, the same bank that had approved their mortgage 31 years earlier, with a handshake and a smile from a loan officer who had since retired. Robert set the coffee mug down carefully, the way a man sets something down when his hands aren't entirely steady, and opened it. Final notice of foreclosure. The words sat on the page like a verdict. He read it twice, then folded it along the same crease it had arrived in and slid it into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt, over his heart, where Patricia wouldn't think to look. She was upstairs, humming an old Christmas song while she wrapped presents for grandchildren who lived 2 states away and visited twice a year if they were lucky. He wanted to give her one more morning of humming before the world came crashing back in. The trouble had started 18 months ago. Robert's heart attack had come on a Tuesday in June, sudden and vicious, the kind that made the ER doctor use words like widowmaker in a tone reserved for miracles narrowly avoided. The surgery had saved his life. It had also cost $41,000 after insurance. They had done everything right, or so they believed. Patricia had gone back to substitute teaching at Millhaven Elementary, the same school where she'd taught 3rd grade for 26 years. Robert had sold his prized 1967 pickup truck, restored piece by piece over a decade in the garage, to a collector 3 towns over for $11,000. They had called the bank and worked out what they were told was a temporary forbearance plan on their mortgage payments. What nobody had explained clearly, buried in fine print, neither of them fully understood, was that the forbearance plan didn't pause their payments so much as defer them into a lump sum, compounding with fees until an original shortfall of $6,000 became a demand for $19,400. When they missed it, the foreclosure process began quietly, the way a river erodes a bank until the ground gives way. Robert had gone to the bank 3 times in the last 2 months, sitting with a different representative each visit, none of whom had the authority to actually help him, only the authority to explain in patient and practiced tones why nothing could be done. He had called the county's legal aid office and been told the earliest appointment was in 5 weeks. He had asked his son Michael for a loan, and the silence that followed had told him everything about where things stood between them. Michael had a family of his own, a mortgage of his own, and an old resentment Robert could no longer clearly remember, but that Michael apparently had never let go of. He walked out to the back porch that morning with his coffee going cold in his hand and looked at the yard where he had built Michael a treehouse 30 years ago, now sagging and grey, forgotten in the branches of the old oak. Patricia's garden beds were covered in snow, waiting for spring bulbs that might this year belong to someone else entirely. "You're up early," Patricia said, appearing in the doorway in her robe, her white hair still loose around her shoulders, the way she wore it only in the mornings, before she pinned it up for the day. She had been beautiful at 22 when he married her, and she was beautiful now, though her eyes had grown more tired in the last 2 months than he liked to see. "Couldn't sleep," Robert said, which was true, though not the whole truth. Patricia came and stood beside him, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the cold. "Was that the mail I heard?" Robert felt the folded paper against his chest like a stone. "Just circulars," he said. "Christmas sales." She studied him for a moment, the way she had studied restless students for 26 years, the way that always seemed to see straight through whatever a person was trying to hide. But she didn't press. Perhaps she already knew more than she let on. Perhaps, like him, she had decided that pretending was easier than facing it directly, at least for one more morning. "The Hutchins boy is coming by later to help you get the lights up," she said instead. "I told him 3 o'clock. Robert nodded, though the thought of Christmas lights felt almost cruel now, a decoration for a house that might not be theirs by New Year's. The notice in his pocket had given them until December 24th, Christmas Eve, to vacate the premises voluntarily, or the county sheriff's department would carry out the eviction with law enforcement present. 9 days. He thought of the mechanic shop he'd run for 32 years off Main Street, Hendrick's Auto Repair, sold 6 years ago to fund a retirement that was supposed to be simple and safe. He thought of every engine he'd fixed for a neighbor who couldn't quite afford the bill, every time he'd told a customer, "Pay me when you can," because that was what you did in Millhaven, a place where people looked out for each other. He wondered whether that Millhaven still existed, or whether it had quietly become something else while he wasn't looking. That afternoon, he drove to the bank one more time, determined to find someone who could look at 31 years of on-time payments and see more than a number on a spreadsheet. He sat in the lobby 40 minutes before a young manager named Ashley Corbett agreed to see him, her expression apologetic before she'd said a word. "Mr. Hendricks, I've reviewed your file again," she said, not unkindly. "I understand this is difficult, but the foreclosure process was authorized at the regional level. There's nothing I can do at this branch to reverse it. I'm sorry, I truly am." 9 days before Christmas, Robert said quietly. "Is there anyone above you I can talk to?" "You can file an appeal," Ashley said, "but the earliest it would be reviewed is mid-January. The eviction date doesn't change during that process." Robert thanked her, because his mother had raised him to always thank people even when they gave him nothing, and walked back out into the cold, the sound of a distant motorcycle engine echoing somewhere across town as he climbed into his truck and sat for a long moment before he could bring himself to drive home. By the 3rd day, word had begun to spread through Millhaven, though not in the way Robert expected. He hadn't told anyone beyond Patricia, who had finally found the folded notice in his shirt pocket while doing laundry, and sat down hard at the kitchen table, her hand pressed flat against her chest, as if to keep her own heart from doing something reckless. 9 days, she'd whispered, reading it twice the way he had. "Robert, why didn't you tell me?" "I was going to fix it," he said, and hated how small the words sounded once they were out in the open air between them. "We fix it together," Patricia said. "We always have." So together they had gone to see a lawyer, a young man named David Foster, who worked out of a strip mall office and specialized in consumer debt cases. He was kind and thorough and utterly without power to stop what was already in motion. "The bank followed the letter of the contract," he explained, sliding the paperwork back across his desk. "It's predatory, in my opinion, the way that forbearance clause was written. But proving that in court takes months, sometimes years, and the eviction date doesn't wait on a lawsuit. I could file an emergency motion, but the judge who handles these cases isn't back from vacation, until January 2nd. "Christmas is the 24th, Robert said. "I know," Foster said, and for the first time his professional composure slipped, just slightly, into something like genuine regret. "I wish I had better news for two people who don't deserve any of this." It was Patricia's sister, Nancy, calling from 2 counties over to ask about Christmas dinner plans, who first heard the whole story and immediately told her hairdresser, who told a woman at the diner on Route 9, who happened to be the girlfriend of a man named Curtis Yoder, a member of the Iron Crossroads Motorcycle Club, the local charter that met at a converted garage on the edge of town. Curtis mentioned it that evening at the clubhouse, mostly in passing, a piece of small-town gossip about an old couple getting thrown out of their house right before Christmas by a bank that had made record profits that same year, according to the newspaper someone had left folded on the bar. Nobody in the room reacted much at first. Then a man near the back, older than most of the others, with grey in his beard and a Vietnam veteran patch stitched next to a dozen others on his cut, set down his drink. "Hendricks," Wayne Doyle said slowly, like he was testing the name against a memory. "Robert Hendricks, ran the auto shop on 5th Street. "That's the one," Curtis said. "You know him?" Wayne didn't answer right away. He was remembering a winter 26 years ago, when he'd been a 19-year-old kid with a broken-down motorcycle and no money, sitting on the curb outside Hendricks Auto Repair after the shop had already closed for the night. He remembered the door opening anyway, a man in coveralls waving him inside out of the cold, spending 3 hours replacing a blown gasket without ever once mentioning payment. When Wayne had finally worked up the nerve to ask how much he owed, Robert had wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Buy yourself a decent helmet with the money you'd have spent on a tow truck. That's payment enough." Wayne had been coming off 2 years in prison at the time, fresh out and friendless, half convinced the whole town had already decided who he was and would never let him be anything else. That night in the garage had been the first time in longer than he could remember that someone had looked at him without flinching. "Yeah," Wayne said finally, quiet enough that only Curtis heard him clearly. "I know him." He didn't say anything else that night. He finished his drink, said goodnight to the room, and rode home through the cold with something turning over in his chest that felt a great deal like debt long overdue. Meanwhile, Robert and Patricia spent those days in a strange, suspended grief, packing boxes they hoped they wouldn't need while trying to keep some shred of Christmas alive for the grandchildren who were still, as far as they knew, planning to visit on the 23rd. Patricia insisted on putting up the tree anyway, a small artificial one they'd used for 15 years, its branches slightly bent from being stored in the attic. "Whatever happens," she said, arranging the same ornaments they'd hung every December since Michael was in grade school, "this house has had 31 Christmases in it. It's going to have one more, even if it's the last." Robert watched her hang a paper snowflake Michael had made in 3rd grade, the edges soft and yellowed with age, and felt something in his own chest crack a little further. He had spent his whole life being the man who fixed things, engines, roofs, a neighbor's flooded basement, a teenager's first car. He did not know how to be the man who couldn't fix the one thing that mattered most. On the 5th day, a letter arrived from the county sheriff's office confirming the eviction date and time, 10 o'clock in the morning, December 24th. Deputies would be present to ensure an orderly transition. The word orderly sat strangely on the page, as if there were anything orderly about watching 71 years of memory carried out onto a snow-covered lawn. That same afternoon, without either of them knowing it, Wayne Doyle sat in the back office of the Iron Crossroads clubhouse and made the first of what would become nearly 200 phone calls. The calls Wayne made were not to strangers. They were to men and women he had ridden with for 2 decades, from Millhaven to towns as far as 300 miles away, charter presidents, old friends, people who owed him favors and people to whom he owed favors in return. He did not ask them for money, though several offered it. He asked them to be present. He asked them to bring their bikes. "A bank is throwing an old veteran and his wife out of their house on Christmas Eve," he told each of them. The same line every time, like a bell he kept ringing until enough people heard it. "The man fixed my bike for free when I had nothing and nobody. I aim to make sure he's not alone when they come to take his house. I'm not asking anybody to do anything but show up and stand there, that's all. Just stand there." Some of them asked questions about the legality of it, about what exactly standing there would accomplish against a court order and armed deputies. Wayne didn't have a clean answer for that. "I don't rightly know if it changes the outcome," he admitted to Curtis one evening, the two of them going over a list of confirmed riders that had already passed 100 names. "But I know what it's like to feel like the whole world's decided you don't matter enough to fight for." I'm not letting that happen to Robert Hendricks in front of his own house. While Wayne worked the phones, Robert and Patricia faced their own private trial by fire. Michael finally called on the 6th day, his voice tight with something between guilt and defensiveness, having heard about the foreclosure from his Aunt Nancy rather than from his own father. "Dad, why didn't you tell me it was this serious?" "Would it have changed anything?" Robert asked, not unkindly, but honestly. The silence on the line answered the question well enough. Michael and his wife were 3 months behind on their own mortgage after a layoff at his plant, a fact he hadn't told his parents either, both of them equally proud, equally unwilling to be a burden, and it was only now, staring down the loss of the house he'd grown up in, that Michael understood how much that pride had cost all of them. "I can't fix this for you, Dad. I wish to God I could. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for a lot of things, not just this." "I know, son," Robert said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it without reservation. Whatever old argument had put distance between them mattered less now than it had in years. "Come for Christmas Eve anyway, whatever house we're standing in by then." On the 7th day, Patricia's hands shook while she packed the good china into newspaper, wrapping each plate the way her own mother had taught her 60 years earlier. Robert found her sitting on the kitchen floor afterward, not crying exactly, but staring at the space where the table had always stood, where 31 Christmas mornings had happened, where Michael had once carved his initials into the underside of the wood as a boy and been swatted for it gently by a mother who had secretly been proud of the mark he'd left behind. "I keep thinking about all the people who sat at that table," Patricia said. "Michael's christening dinner, your retirement party, the year your mother came to stay with us before she passed. All of it happened right here, in this kitchen, in this house, and in 9 days, 8 now, it just becomes someone else's kitchen, someone else's walls." Robert sat down on the floor beside her, his knees protesting the way they always did now, and took her hand. "I don't have an answer for you, Pat. I've spent 2 months trying to find one, and I keep coming up empty. All I know is I've got you, and whatever happens on the 24th, that part doesn't change." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the only sound the soft tick of the kitchen clock, and faintly, from somewhere out on the road, the low growl of a motorcycle passing by that neither of them thought anything of. They didn't know that the sound would become familiar to them by week's end, that Wayne Doyle had, by that point, confirmed nearly 300 riders from 12 different charters across 4 states, all of them planning to arrive in Millhaven before dawn on December 24th. They didn't know that a local news reporter named Deborah Klein, tipped off by Curtis's girlfriend, had begun quietly investigating the bank's forbearance practices and found 2 other Millhaven families who had suffered nearly identical treatment in the past year. They didn't know that David Foster, the young lawyer, had spent his evenings drafting an emergency motion he intended to file the moment the courthouse reopened, regardless of what happened before then. What they knew on the 8th night, standing together in the kitchen with the moving boxes stacked against the wall like tombstones for a life they'd built, was that they had each other, and that the sun would rise the next morning, whether they were ready for it or not. Robert lay awake that night longer than usual, listening to Patricia's steady breathing beside him, running through every possibility he hadn't yet tried. In the morning, he decided, he would go back to the bank one final time. Not to argue, not to plead, just to look Ashley Corbett in the eye and ask her one more time if there was truly nothing left to be done. Because a man who had spent his whole life fixing things owed it to himself and to Patricia not to stop trying until the very last hour had come and gone. Earlier that same evening, unknown to Robert, Deborah Klein had knocked on the door of a small house 2 streets over, where a widow named Carol Fenwick had lost her own home to a nearly identical forbearance clause the previous spring. Carol answered questions for nearly an hour, her voice steady, even as she described packing 40 years of belongings into a storage unit she could barely afford. "Nobody came for us," she told Deborah quietly. "Nobody even knew our name by the time the bank was done. I hope somebody hears about the Hendricks family before the same thing happens to them." Deborah thanked her, drove home through the cold, and stayed up past midnight cross-referencing county foreclosure filings, building a pattern she was increasingly certain the bank would not want made public. Neither Robert nor Patricia knew, as they finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, how many people across Mill Haven had already begun quietly working on their behalf. A reporter chasing a pattern of injustice, a lawyer drafting a motion he hoped he'd never need to file, and nearly 300 riders checking their gas tanks and setting alarms for 4 in the morning, determined not to let one more family disappear from their town without a fight. Robert's final visit to the bank on the 9th day accomplished exactly what he expected it would, which was nothing. Ashley Corbett met him with the same apologetic eyes, the same helpless shrug of institutional powerlessness, and told him gently that the eviction would proceed as scheduled the following morning. He thanked her anyway, shook her hand, and walked out into a Mill Haven evening that had turned bitterly cold, the sky low and grey and threatening more snow. He drove home slowly, past the elementary school where Patricia had taught for over 2 decades, past Hendricks Auto Repair with its new owner's name now painted over his own on the sign, past the church on 5th Street where they'd been married 50 years earlier almost to the week. The whole town felt that evening like a photograph of a life he was about to lose. That night, neither Robert nor Patricia slept much. They lay in the dark, holding hands across the space between their pillows, listening to the house settle around them the way it always had, the particular creak of the second stair, the hum of the furnace kicking on. At some point past midnight, Patricia whispered into the dark, "Do you remember our first Christmas here? We didn't have money for a tree, and you cut branches from the yard and wired them together into something that was supposed to look like one." Robert laughed softly, the sound rusty from disuse over the last stressful week. "Ugliest tree God ever saw." "I loved it," Patricia said. "I loved it because you built it for me out of nothing, because that's what you've always done. Built things out of nothing when we needed them most." "I couldn't build us out of this one, Pat," Robert said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way it hadn't in years. "You tried," she said. "That's what matters. Whatever happens tomorrow, you tried every single day." Morning came grey and cold, the sky spitting light snow as Robert stood at the bedroom window at 6 a.m., unable to sleep any longer, watching the empty street below. 2 moving trucks were scheduled to arrive at 9, hired at the last minute by Michael, who had driven through the night from 3 states away with his wife and 2 children to be there, however things unfolded. The sheriff's deputies were due at 10. It was at 7:15 that Robert first heard it, a low sound on the edge of hearing, like distant thunder that didn't fade the way thunder should. He frowned, straining to place it, and Patricia came to stand beside him at the window, her robe wrapped tight around her. "What is that?" she asked. The sound grew steadily, resolving itself over the next several minutes into something unmistakable. The deep, rolling rumble of motorcycle engines, dozens of them, then hundreds, echoing off the frozen storefronts of Main Street and rolling down Elm Street toward their house like a wave, building toward shore. Robert's first instinct absurdly was alarm, some half-formed thought about trouble, about the wrong kind of attention on the worst possible morning. Then he saw them. They came in formation, headlights cutting through the grey morning, leather and denim and steel, riders bundled against the cold with patches from clubs Robert didn't recognize, alongside ones he did, filling Elm Street from end to end, engines idling in a chorus that seemed to shake the windows in their frames. At the front of the column, a broad-shouldered man with a grey beard swung his leg off his bike and walked up the snow-covered front path with the particular deliberate gait of someone carrying old memories on his shoulders. Robert opened the front door in his pajamas and robe, Patricia just behind him, both of them too stunned to speak. "Mr. Hendricks," Wayne Doyle said, extending a gloved hand. "Wayne Doyle. 26 years ago, you fixed a kid's motorcycle for free on a cold night and told him to buy a helmet instead of paying you. I don't know if you remember that kid." Robert stared at him for a long moment, something stirring in an old corner of memory. And then it clicked into place, a young face beneath years of change. "The Yamaha," Robert said slowly. "Blown head gasket. You were shaking so bad from the cold, I thought you'd freeze before I got it running." "That's the one," Wayne said, his voice thick. "You didn't know me from anybody, didn't ask what I'd done to end up broke and alone on a curb in December. You just fixed my bike and sent me on my way with my dignity intact. I never forgot that. Word got around town about what's happening to you and Mrs. Hendricks today, and I figured it was long past time somebody looked out for you the way you looked out for me." Robert's eyes moved past Wayne to the street, where the column of motorcycles stretched further than he could see in either direction, engines still rumbling low, riders standing beside their bikes in the cold, waiting. Patricia had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. "There's near 400 of us here," Wayne said. "We can't stop a court order, Mr. Hendricks. I want to be honest with you about that. But we can make sure the whole town sees exactly what that bank is doing to a man who spent his life fixing what was broken and never once asked for anything back. And we brought a few other things besides." He gestured behind him, and Robert saw for the first time that several of the motorcycles were towing small trailers loaded with something under tarps, and that a line of riders had already begun quietly organizing near the moving trucks Michael had rented, ready to help however help was needed. At that exact moment, a white sedan pulled up at the curb, and Deborah Klein climbed out with a cameraman from the Millhaven news station, her breath fogging in the cold air as she stared at the extraordinary scene filling the entire street. "Mr. Hendricks," she called, hurrying up the path, "would you be willing to speak with me about what's happening here this morning?" Robert looked past her, taking in the scene properly for the first time. The sheer scale of it, riders as far as he could see in both directions, neighbors emerging onto their own porches in bathrobes and winter coats to watch, drawn by engines that had woken half the block. He thought of 32 years spent fixing cars for people who couldn't always pay, of the quiet decency he'd never once expected to be repaid, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in 9 days. "Give me a minute," he told Deborah, and turned back to Wayne. "I don't rightly know what to say to 400 people who came out in the cold for an old mechanic and his wife." "You don't have to say anything," Wayne told him. "Just let us stand here. That's payment enough." Robert looked at Deborah Klein, then back at the street full of riders standing silent and steady in the cold, then at Patricia, whose hand had found his own and gripped it tight. "Yes," he said. "I think it's time somebody heard the whole story." He told her everything: the heart attack, the forbearance clause buried in fine print, the ballooning debt, the 3 visits to a bank that had no answer beyond apology, the lawyer who couldn't file a motion until January, the county sheriff scheduled to arrive within the hour. Deborah recorded all of it, her cameraman capturing the rows of motorcycles behind him, engines still idling, riders standing in quiet solidarity that needed no further explanation. At 9:45, the sheriff's department arrived, 2 patrol cars easing carefully through the crowd that had gathered, along with a growing number of Millhaven residents who had come out of their houses at the sound of the engines, drawn by curiosity and then held by something deeper once they understood what they were witnessing. Deputy Sheriff Raymond Alcott stepped out of his vehicle, taking in the scene with visible unease. "Folks," he said, addressing the gathered crowd through a hand-cradled bullhorn, "I understand the sentiment here, but I have a court order to execute. I need everyone to remain calm and let us do our jobs." "Nobody's stopping you from doing your job, Deputy," Wayne Doyle said, stepping forward, his tone measured and respectful. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're here to stand with a good man on the worst morning of his life, same as any of these folks would do for their own neighbor. That's not against any law I know of." Alcott studied the crowd for a long moment. The riders, the neighbors, the local news camera now rolling, and Robert and Patricia Hendricks standing on their own front porch with a lifetime behind them and no clear picture of what lay ahead. He walked up the path alone and spoke quietly with Robert for several minutes, out of earshot of the crowd, reviewing the paperwork one final time. It was in that conversation that something shifted. Deborah Klein's report had already begun circulating. A local radio station picked up the story live, and within 20 minutes, a producer from a station 2 counties over was calling the bank's corporate offices for comment, having connected Robert's story to the 2 other Millhaven families Deborah had uncovered during her investigation. A regional vice president named Harold Whitfield, informed of the unfolding public relations crisis by a nervous branch manager, made a phone call of his own at 9:52 that morning to David Foster, the young lawyer who had been awake since 5, preparing an emergency motion he now might not need to file. By 10:15, 15 minutes past the scheduled eviction time, Deputy Alcott walked back to his patrol car and made a call to dispatch. He returned to Robert and Patricia's porch with an expression that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Hendricks," he said, "the bank's regional office has just authorized an immediate 30-day stay on the eviction, pending review of your forbearance agreement. They're saying there may have been irregularities in how the terms were presented to you. I've been instructed to stand down." For a moment, nobody on the crowded street said anything at all. Then Patricia's knees buckled, and Robert caught her, both of them holding onto each other as the first sound of applause broke out from the gathered neighbors, quickly swelling into something larger, riders revving their engines in celebration, the whole street filling with noise and breath-fogged cheering under a sky that had finally begun to clear. 30 days, Robert said to Wayne, his voice unsteady. "Might not be enough." "It'll be enough," Wayne said. "Foster tells me the irregularities Klein's report dug up are the kind that make banks settle fast, not fight long. And even if it takes longer than 30 days, you've got 400 people now who know your name and won't forget it. Whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone, not anymore." What followed that afternoon became, in the retelling over the following years, the thing Millhaven remembered most about that particular December. Not the foreclosure crisis itself, but what happened after the stay was granted. The riders didn't leave. Instead, dozens of them pulled the tarps off the trailers they'd towed into town, revealing not weapons or trouble, but firewood, canned goods, and, most surprising of all, a fully decorated Christmas tree donated by a charter member who ran a tree farm 2 counties over, which they carried into the Hendricks living room and set up in the corner where Patricia's small artificial tree had stood for 15 years. Michael arrived from the driveway where he'd been unloading the now unnecessary moving truck to find his parents' living room filled with strangers in leather, his own children wide-eyed at the sight of so many motorcycles, and his father laughing. really laughing, the kind of laugh Michael hadn't heard from him in years, as Wayne Doyle told the story of a blown head gasket and a helmet bought instead of a repair bill. That evening, as the sun set early over Millhaven and most of the riders began the long journey home, Wayne lingered at the door with his hand extended once more. "Merry Christmas, Robert. You didn't have to do any of this," Robert said, gripping his hand. "Neither did you," Wayne said, 26 years ago for a broke kid on a curb. Debts like that don't expire. I'm just glad I got the chance to pay it forward before it was too late." Patricia stood in the doorway that night, watching the last of the taillights disappear down Elm Street, the paper snowflake Michael had made in 3rd grade still hanging on their tree, 31 years of Christmases behind them, and however many more waited ahead, at least one more certain to come. Robert came to stand beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders the way he had for 50 years, and for the first time in 2 months, neither of them felt the weight of what they might lose. They felt instead the full and undeniable weight of what they still had. A house, a family slowly finding its way back together, and a town that had shown up, engines roaring, exactly when it mattered most.